Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today, March 4th, 2024, Special Education Committee meeting. And today we are going to cover the topic, the intersectionality of emergent multilingual learners as students receiving special education service. So we are talking about two groups of students and the intersection of two groups of students in this committee meeting. To start the meeting, we're going to do a round of introduction. I'm Julie Yang, representing District 3 on Board of Education. I'm going to go to my colleague.
Good morning, everyone. Lynn Harris. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an at-large member of the board.
I would like the board staff to introduce themselves.
Good morning, Lori Christina Webb, Chief of Staff for the board.
Good morning, Juan Ramos, Administrative Services Manager for the board.
Good morning, Peggy Pugh, Chief Academic Officer.
Good morning, board members, board staff. Diana Wiles, Associate Superintendent, Office of Special Education.
Good morning, board members. Kia Murphy. I'm the Director of Special Education Services, Department of Special Education Services.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tamara Hewlett. I am the Director of the Department of English Learners and Multilingual Education.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. And before we dive into today's topic, I would like to ask if there's any feedback or for the information summary of the last meeting on January 22nd. All right, thank you so much. Then that is approved. And let's just dive right into today's topic.
Thank you. If you could bring up the slides for today, we would appreciate it. It's really important that as we talk about these services today and what's available to our students, that we remember that while we may talk in generalities about processes and procedures, each student and their family is different and has unique strengths, assets, and interests, and then also needs. And so while we're talking about them as groups of students, it's really important that we understand that what we're trying to do is create good processes so that each student's needs are elevated in a meeting, in a discussion, and then in the provision of services. So next slide. The outline that we have today is that we will start off with some framing about where this group of students sits in our strategic plan and some key messages, our alignment with the strategic plan, and then who our students are, the emergent multilingual learners as students who also receive special education services, and then time for discussion. And I actually think we've broken it down a few times so that there's times to stop and have discussion because there is some data that will be shared. Next slide. So we're very familiar with the strategic plan, and the pillars that we're speaking of today would be for academic excellence, specific to literacy and mathematics, which really starts with creating an individualized plan for these students. It aligns also with the board's strategic priority in improving math and literacy rates. And then we want to continue to make connections with our anti-racist audit and our action plan. And this, what you'll hear today, aligns and addresses specifically in Domain 6, which is access, equity of access, and really speaking to the observation there that we value the importance of using data, and then some community members perceive that the data is often collected but not fully utilized. So we hope to address that today. Next slide. So the key messages, a lot of words on these slides, but really what it comes down to is that, as I've been saying since the beginning, bullet 1, that these students are students who are emergent multilingual learners and who receive special education services, and that their strategies that are used specifically to address their needs will be unique. And then the second bullet is that while we often compare the data and show the data for our emergent multilingual learners along with other service groups, we don't often break it down to this discrete level that we'll be talking about today, which is our emergent multilingual students who are receiving special education services. But it's important to note that as soon as a student earns learns the language well enough, they exit this category. And so it's really important to note that this shouldn't be a comparative piece to students in other service groups who remain in the service group. And then bullet 3 is really, really important, is that we have 2 sets of services that these students receive: English language development services as well as special education services. And understanding what the language needs are and what the educational disability needs are is the heart of making sure that there's equity for these groups, because it really is based on the unique individual needs. Next slide. So let's start at the very beginning. What is dual identification? We often speak of it and we talk of it in our general board meetings, but the definition that we'll be using and working from today, and as we have, is that it is a student who is an emergent multilingual learner who is currently receiving English language development services in order to learn English, and special education services that are defined through an IEP, an individualized education plan that is unique to that student. And for now, to jump into the full presentation, I'll introduce Tamara Hewlett.
Next slide, please. So good morning again, board members, the public. I'm here to briefly just explain how students are identified for English language development services. Most of our students will be an emergent multilingual learner first before they are identified as a student needing special education services. So we wanted to make sure we started with identification for English language development services and what that process is. First of all, it's important to understand that our program is a federal program, and it has particular mandates and timelines to which every local education agency must adhere. Identification happens during a student's initial enrollment into school. It's our legal obligation as a school system to determine whether a student is a potential emergent multilingual learner. This is determined by what we call the Home Language Survey. The Home Language Survey consists of several questions, and depending on the responses from parents or guardians when they complete the form, students are then screened using a screener that's determined by the Maryland State Department of Education. Depending on those results of the assessment, a student will either qualify for English language development services or not. Local education agencies have within 30 days at the start of the school year of first enrollment to determine if a student is a potential EML and to screen them for services. Students that come after the beginning of that 30-day school period, it's incumbent upon the schools to screen students within 2 weeks of arrival. So prior to the 2017-2018 school year, the Home Language Survey consisted of 2 questions. If a family indicated a language other than English or in addition to English for either one of these questions, the student was screened for services. That's how you determine whether they're a potential EML, based on the responses. So the questions at that time were, 1, what language or languages do you or others speak to your child? And 2, what language or languages does your child speak to you or others? So this means that our current 7th grade through 12th grade students, they completed this version of the Home Language Survey. So they were identified as potential EMLs if they had a language other than English for any one of these 2 questions. And then we administered the screener. And then depending on how they scored, they either qualified for services or not. Now with the advent of ESSA, 2017-2018 school year, the questions changed, okay? So there are now, next slide, please. There are now 3 Home Language Survey questions. Families that indicate a language other than English for 2 or more of the 3 questions will be identified as a potential EML, and then they will go through the screening process. So as a school system, we've incorporated the Maryland Home Language Survey questions into our new student information form, since this is information that's required to be completed upon first enrollment. Our new student information form is available in our top 7 languages. And so as a district, we want to make sure that the language is accessible to the families as they are registering so they understand what is being asked of them. So as of the 2017-2018 school year, the 3 home language survey questions are: 1, what language or languages did the student first learn to speak? 2, what language or languages does the student use most often to communicate? Or 3, what language or languages are spoken in your home? So that means our current 6th graders through kindergarten students, their families had to answer these 3 questions for us to determine whether or not they were a potential EML. And if they were a potential EML, we then screen them for using the WIDA, if it's kindergarten, K-screener, or what we call the WIDA screener. And again, that's what all LEAs, local education agencies across the state of Maryland, uses to screen for services. It's important to note that it is not uncommon to have English show up as a response in 1 or more of the responses to our home language survey. This is representative of the fact that most of the students across the United States that receive English language development services are actually born in the United States. These students are simultaneous bilinguals or multilingual learners. So as a result, we often, when we pull our data, we often see that when looking for what language is most spoken at home, English might be a very prevalent language. It does not mean that they're not a potential, because they had 2 other questions where they might also be hearing and first learned a different language other than English. So again, most of our duly coded students are identified as EMLs before they're identified as students needing special education services. I will now turn it over to Ms. Wiles, who will outline how the students we serve often intersect.
Next slide. So good morning again. We thought it was interesting data to share with you all to show the top 10 home languages that our students who are duly identified speak. Approximately 85% of those students speak Spanish or English, but we have a wide variety of students who speak multiple languages in a home, which gives us a diverse group of students who are identified as duly identified students.
Yeah. So
Next slide.
actually, it's the discussion slide.
Discussion. I knew it was coming.
You're ready
yes.
to ask questions? All right, so I will start off. Thank you for sharing that information. It's interesting. I have older children, and they were also, I remember kindergarten orientation, where they both were tested to see if they qualify for our, at that time called ESOL. Right now we call ELD services. And with our county resident, 1/3 of our county residents are born outside of the United States. So many of our residents speak another language. In some community, I know that in Asian American communities, over half of the residents are born outside of United States. So this is not directly related to today's topic, but is related to ELD identification. So I know that school district is having some change of how we do kindergarten orientation. So would that impact the WIDA testing or identification process? Do we already have a plan of how to address that?
Thanks. Really great question. The screening will not be impacted. We typically wait until the start of the school year. And since every new K student has to complete a new student information form, the English language development teams at the school look at the data, and then they say, oh, we work with our Office of Technology Integration, and they provide a report for the schools and the staff to see what were the responses for our school on the Maryland Home Language Survey. They determine whether they're potential EMLs, and then within the first 30 days of the school year, that's when screening happens. So we did not typically screen students before the start of the school year. The English language development team at kindergarten orientation would be a touch point.
Okay.
And so the staff and schools are currently figuring out ways to ensure that parents understand what the question is that they're being asked when they fill out the new student information form. But screening typically happens
After first.
in August, like when the school year has started.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yes.
My other question is, because we are talking about duly identified students, for us and for the audience out there, can you or do you have the numbers to tell us, like for example, what percentage of our students receive special education? What percentage of our students receive ELD services? And what is the percentage of the duly identified students at this moment? I know that number can be changing. Do we have that data?
So the next set of slides will be data slides.
Okay.
But the approximate number of students, total number of students who receive special education is 22,000 or so. Tamara, if you want to share about the number of students who are EML.
So we have approximately 5,648 students that are, well, not duly coded. That's duly coded. For our student count for EMLs, it's about 32,000 on, 500 on a good day.
Okay.
That number is rising.
Okay.
And then for duly coded, then we have about 648.
Thank you. Ms. Harris?
Yep, just a couple of questions for me. So how are we making sure, you mentioned it a little bit, when families are filling out the Maryland Home Language Survey, that they are supported in every way they need to be to actually understand and answer that survey? Because we know, I think for a long time, we just assumed that families were fully literate in their primary language, when that's not always the case. So even translating a form may not do what we need it to do. So how is that working?
So this is where we rely on our schools to ensure that as they're completing the forms, the registrars are ensuring and asking questions to make sure that they understand, and using the various language services that we have available if there is a language barrier. For example, our registrars may not speak the language of the family coming in, so how do we use, for example, the language line or any interpretation services for schools that are innovating with their kindergarten orientation light, making sure that they have some representatives who can language at the event, whatever events they host, to support families in that way.
Okay.
And our ELD team, if we see data is missing, they then reach out to families just to ensure that did you understand the question? Is there, and they might call the language line to, foster a conversation to get that information. So it's not perfect, but we try in various ways to ensure that our families understand the questions that are being asked, and can complete it.
And so for the thousands watching at home,
Yes.
WIDA,
Yes. So WIDA used to stand for something, it no longer stands for something. WIDA is just WIDA, it's just the name, but WIDA is the consortium, the big group, right? So if you think about language framework and a language assessment, WIDA is the organization where most states follow the standards for language development. And so they support in instruction and assessment. So they have two kind of major arms. And so Maryland is a state that participates in the consortium. So we get our assessment materials, our annual WIDA Access for ELS assessment, which we just closed the window on Friday. We get our assessment to monitor language development and growth every year, and we get our screener, which is what they use to determine if they are an actual EML from WIDA, which doesn't stand for anything anymore.
And so the screening tool is, a WIDA screening tool is used
Yes.
regardless of the age at which a student is entering the system. So it's a flexible tool.
Correct.
In that way.
Correct. There is a WIDA K screener, so one set aside for K, and then the other assessments are banded. So there's a 1 to 2 band assessment, there's a first grade band, a 2 to 3 band, a 4 to 5 band, a 6 to 8 band, and a 9 to 12 band. Yeah.
And so you mentioned typically, which is so no longer like the case for a lot of our families, assuming a student starts on the first day of school and they've been identified through the Maryland Home Language Survey, within the first 30 days, the ELD team at the school is doing the screenings.
Yes.
And then if a student enters in mid-year, within 2 weeks, the school
Correct.
is doing the screening. So what are the students doing while they're waiting to be screened during that first 30 days?
They're learning. Everyone's in class, and the team has a plan for, we're going to pull these few kids to administer the screener. Kindergarten screener could be anywhere about 20 minutes, depending on how much language they have, language production. It's important to note that the screener has 4 domains. However, in kindergarten, the students are not administered the 4 domains because students are not expected to be readers and writers yet. So they take the listening and the speaking in the first semester, and then they start, once they come after that, they start taking the reading and the writing up until first grade.
Okay.
So
If the student isn't screened, say, until day 30, they're just in class without any specific supports, or?
Well, most of the students we screen come in kindergarten, and so they're learning routines. They're in an environment with a lot of oracy, oral language development, just by the nature of being a kindergarten student. And the teachers, because it's a shared responsibility, are all ensuring that they are maybe providing scaffolds. Kindergartners need a lot of scaffolds anyway, language or not. So a lot of visuals, a lot of pictures, and the supports needed to get the students through the day. So schools try to screen as quickly as possible because there are a few steps that happen after that in terms of generating a parent notification letter to inform the families that your student did qualify for services. So there's a lot of communication with the families via parent notification letter. If the family decides to refuse services, there's a different form we called refusal of program that they complete. So there's additional communication happening to the families in this period of time. And then they have, schools have 45 days. You have 30 initially to screen, and then 45 to generate what we call the EL plan, which is what accommodations are necessary to support the students. And so those first 30 days, the classroom teacher and the ELD teacher, they're getting a lot of data. This student might benefit from Read2. The student might benefit from a bilingual dictionary. The student might benefit from extra time, small group setting. So it's a information gathering moment as much as it is learning experience for our newly minted kindergarten students.
But we are having more and more students enter our system
who are not kindergartners.
Sometimes much beyond that. So
Yes.
they're coming in, say they're 14, 15.
Correct.
And then they're screened, but until they're screened, are they just going to class at their assigned school?
Yes, until they're screened, they're not necessarily sectioned into, if we talking about middle school and high school, they would need to be added to the course. So the students, and this is why screening happens way faster in a middle and high school. Most of the students in our program are already identified. So middle schools, high school teachers, they're not having to screen 80, 90 students. It might be 3 students. So the 30 days should not be 30 days for a middle schooler or a high schooler. The 2 weeks should not be 2 weeks for a middle schooler or a high schooler, depending on when you come in, because those numbers are drastically lower than what an elementary school would be faced with. Everyone understands the urgency of identifying whether or not they're a potential EML and then using that to determine if they have to be screened, and then screening the students so that they can be routed to the appropriate course and have the appropriate supports necessary.
And we're making sure that communication back and forth with the family is in the preferred language of the family and taking into account their language fluency.
Yes, so we have all of those documents in those languages.
And if they're not literate in their
And if they're not literate, that's again where that touch point with the English language development teacher calling, using the language line to support. I'm sending this form home. It might have a lot of words on it, but let me explain to you what it is. And again, this is federally what we are required to do. So we're required to send the parent notification letter home to say your child qualifies for services, check yes, check no. If a family refuses services, we want to make sure you understand the benefit of the program. And if they continue to refuse services, it is critical and it says it on the form, it's critical that our families understand, even if you refuse services, you still have to take the WIDA Access for ELS assessment when it comes time in January, because that's the federal mandate, that we still have to measure your language proficiency regardless of if you receive services or not. So a lot of connection with the families to make sure that they understand. And we don't just send the parent notification letter home once. If we send it home once and we don't get it, we send it home again. We do it at least 3 times and make sure we document that when we've sent it home, if it hasn't been received, we have the dates of all of that, because we have to ensure that we have given it our best effort to ensure that our families understand that we have this program to support in language, and that the students receive the services.
Thank you. And thank you for that clarification, because if you look at it, EML students, it's about a fifth of our population. So like you say, the number is ever increasing. How we iron out the procedures to make it a quick turnaround for students, it's important. So you may proceed.
Go to the next slide. Now we're going to talk about some of the data for our duly identified students. As we said, about 22,000 students are identified as students with disabilities receiving special education services in a district. About 32,000 are EML students. And of that group, as of the date that this data was pulled, 5,902 students in total were identified as both EML and receiving special education services. Excuse me. About 76% of our duly identified students are Hispanic and 11% are Black or identified as Black. Where you see the school level special, that represents the students who are in our special schools, Rica, Stephen Knowles, Longview, Sandburg, and Rock Terrace. Students at our special schools do continue to receive their ELD services as needed. Next slide. When we look at our duly identified students by diploma versus non-diploma earning, what track they're on, approximately 91% of our duly identified students are pursuing a high school diploma. Next slide. Our students who are pursuing a certificate of completion, as we talked about in our last special populations meeting, those are our alternative learning outcome students, also make up a portion of this population of students, approximately 519 students, and that is 9% of the total number of duly identified students. Next slide. When we look at the data by English language proficiency, about 32% of our duly identified students are on level 1 English language proficiency, 27% at level 2, 34% at level 3, and 8% are at level 4. Next slide. When we look at the performance on the English Language Arts Maryland Comprehensive Assessment Program, or MCAP, we see that our duly identified students are scoring primarily at levels 1 and 2. This data highlights the challenges that the student group face with statewide assessments where both language acquisition and the need for accommodations because of special education services may impact their demonstration of mastery of the skills being assessed. However, it's encouraging to see that 61% of our duly identified students are scoring at a level 2 on the English Language Arts MCAP. Next slide. For our non-diploma or ALO students who are duly identified, 83% are scoring at level 1 on the English Language Arts Dynamic Learning Maps. And if you recall from our last special populations meeting, we talked about the DLM as the state assessment for our ALO students or our non-diploma students. That's comparable to what our high school graduate diploma students are taking. So this is their state assessment. These are students who have some of the most significant needs, who are also identified as EML. Next slide. On the math MCAP, our duly identified students are scoring at level 1 and 2, with about 67% at level 1 and 30% at level 2. Next slide. During the spring administration of the Algebra 1 MCAP, 292 duly identified students took the Algebra 1 test, and 73% scored at level 1, while 27% scored at level 2. Next slide. Next slide. On the Dynamic Learning Maps math assessment, we see that 7% of our duly identified students who will receive a certificate of completion scored a level 3, with 10% scoring a level 2 and 81% scoring a level 1 in the math Dynamic Learning Maps assessment. Next slide. And now I'll pause for questions.
Right, thank you for the numbers. Can we go back to slide number 10, please? Number 10, thank you so much. So these are the numbers of the total numbers. If you look at this number, our Hispanic students percentage high. Can you tell our audience I probably need the EML department to come down. In our English emerging learner population, can we kind of have the breakdown of who are the people in our EML population?
Sure, if you do one more question by the time you come back.
Okay, absolutely, absolutely. That's fair. Now, so if we can look at slide 14, 15. these are the about MCAP, about the testing for diploma bond or certificate bond students. My question is, are any of the students exempt from, for example, the diploma bond, if it's their first year here, any student exempt from the state standardized testing?
So no students are exempt from the WIDA MCAP, Maryland Comprehensive Assessment Program. All of our emergent multilingual learners are expected to take the language assessment. However, our newcomers, which are defined by being in their first 12 months of schooling in the United States, they are exempt from taking the ELA, English Language Arts, Maryland Comprehensive Assessment Program assessment.
Okay.
They are to attempt the math, but not to the point of frustration. And so those are the exemptions. I'm not sure about the special education.
There are no exemptions for special education students.
Okay, and I want to know, for the math, for the English language art, I understand it's going to be conducted in English because it's a test about English ability. For the math, are they tested in English or are they tested in their home language?
So the Maryland Comprehensive Assessment Program has some assessments available in Spanish. I don't want to speak, I don't want to name them because that's not really my department. But some of them are in Spanish, and there are, of course, qualifying rules for who has access to them. They are not available in any other languages at this time. There's a transadaptive version in Spanish for a few of the math assessments.
Right, thank you. Ms. Harris?
Yes, thank you. I am looking at slide 13, which is looking at all of our duly identified students by EL, English Language Proficiency level. And so one of the questions I have sort of generally is, how are we ensuring that it isn't a language barrier that is getting a student identified for special education services?
So 2 factors in the evaluation process for identifying a student with special education services. There are 2 questions that an IEP team has to answer. One is that it is not, the suspected disability is not the result of a language acquisition. That is not why the student is being considered a student with disabilities. And the second is that we are not considering the student because they are, there's a lack of education or formal instruction. And so an IEP team has to rule out those 2 factors in order to determine if the student actually has a disability. Now this is, and we'll talk about this later, as one of the challenges in the special education process. How do you distinguish between a language acquisition, a student who's acquiring language in English, and a student who has a disability, speech, for example, a speech or language disability? And so that's part of the work that we're doing through our ROSE grant, or Reducing Over-Identification in Special Education. We are working on developing processes so that when IEP teams meet, there is a set criteria for making that distinction. But that is a key question. You cannot have an IEP if language acquisition is the primary issue.
Okay, because I look at this table in particular, and I notice that even though, I mean, it's not linearly true for every level, but that there are the most students that are duly identified at level 1, then fewer in 2, 3, and 4. But for all categories, elementary, middle, and high, the fewest number and percentage of students are at level 4. And so to me, that does get to why.
Yeah.
Is that if it's not part of the language acquisition process, that is leading to some of the identification.
Let me see if I can help a little bit. So when you're looking at the English language proficiency level, there are actually 6 levels of what a student can be. We release them from services, direct services, at a level 4. And so a student is expected to make, as was shared at the last meeting, a certain amount of progress as they're with us and as they're acquiring language. So progressing, depending on what level they started at, there's a certain time period when they're supposed to move to the next level. Some of the things that help us understand or help us determine, is it a language issue or is it something different that's impacting the learning, is when WIDA does the screeners, they also give you sort of the can-do statements. So what can a student do at level 2? What are they able to speak to? What are they able to hear? What are they able to communicate about? So if a student is at a level 2 and they're able to do that and they're continuing to progress, then you could say it's not language. But I think it's up to us to really look at what a student is able to do at each of these levels, because if a student is not able to fully acquire language at the level 4, then we wouldn't expect them to have high achieving scores on an English MCAP or a math MCAP, because they're still emerging or developing their use of English. I don't know if you want to add more. That's a general picture.
I just want to say it's not an exact science. And our teams have been in conversation about the fact that we need to provide even more learning to our school teams around ruling out whether it's language or not. What does a bilingual or trilingual, multilingual learner with a disorder of some sort, disability, what does that profile look like? How can we determine it? We get caught between a rock and a hard place, for the best way to put it, because sometimes we wait too long to identify a student who needs special education services, because we want to make sure that we rule out that language acquisition is not the issue. And sometimes we jump too fast with a student who's receiving ELD services and saying, well, they're not making progress, so let's go screen them or go through the EMT process to start figuring out if this is a concern beyond language. And so our teams, we've been in communication, and we're actually going to be doing some deep learning and work together to develop a more tight framework for our schools and our central office to ensure that we're all on the same page around identification and support for our students who are EMLs who need special education services.
Thank you, because as I look at that, and I'm still kind of processing and in looking at this, but it seems to me that if there are truly if the two classifications are truly disaggregated, being identified as an ELD, so student receiving ELD services and a student receiving special education services, the ends at each are going to be different, but the percentages in each category I would think would be roughly similar. Because as far as I'm aware, most students don't grow out of their IEP, grow out of the need for services. Maybe some do, but it seems like we would see more similarity across categories in the percentage of students in each proficiency level receiving special education services. Again, processing, but
I understand what Ms. Harris is raising, that there are concerns out there for over-identification. I'm glad to hear that we're going to examine our practices. I did a little calculation. So if you say special education population is about 22,000, that's about 13% of our student bodies. And if you say the dually identified students is 5,900, and out of our about 32,000, that's about 1/7, 17% of the, so it is slightly higher, between 13% to 17%, but we can take a deeper look at our practices. I want to know, when we look at these data, data is only helpful if you can inform us something about our practice, about our effectiveness in helping our students. So I want to hear from you that when looking at this data, what do you see are some success or some barriers for our students to perform for these standardized testing?
So, excuse me, one of the things is just what Ms. Hewlett was stating. The Office of Special Education and DELMI is working closely to identify where some of those challenges are with identifying students appropriately for either set of services. But the other piece to that is we're developing professional learning opportunities for teachers so that they know how to reach students who are dually identified in their classroom and during daily instruction. Later in the presentation, we're going to talk about one school and the training that we've been providing at the school to help support the students who are dually identified there. But I think that's a huge piece of the work that we have to do, where we're trying to integrate through our summer professional learning and otherwise the work that we're doing with teachers between the two offices. Because the needs of these students are so unique that these are not skills or strategies that teachers necessarily come out of school knowing how to work with a student who is both EML and receives special education services. So that's really a key part of the work that we're doing.
And if I could just add, I think, Montgomery County is a very large county with many students in these groups, in these categories. Yeah. Both special education and ELD services are federally guided. And so there's rules and expectations that are followed both for identification and then for providing services and then for reporting. Huge amounts of accountability. So these data aren't unique. They are received every single year, and then we have to set targets on what are we going to focus our energies on. I think what they've elevated is the unique piece. Some of the work needs to be done just with general teaching, right? So that students can make the progress that they need by using the language, by talking to one another routinely, by engaging in discourse in mathematics, so that the skills that they do have are able to be developed. So it does change and impact our teaching practices. Last year, the elementary teams, the instructional leadership teams were invited to summer learning that really spoke to how do you make a language-rich environment? How do you plan first instruction for these students? And that would be for all EML students. I think what makes this a unique intersectionality is that there's no one other need for a student who receives special education services, right? So each student who receives special education services goes through an identification process with a team that's informed by the data, and then strategies are uniquely identified for that student. And so it's not like all special ed students get this service, as it is more so in language. All students at this level can receive these services. These are good instructional practices that you can use. The strategies work for both groups of students. And so what we're finding is if we can be much more intentional about the professional learning that's provided and provide good first instruction that is inclusive of all students, that has them engaged in reading, writing, speaking, and listening to the extent that they're able to be, and scaffolding for those students who do have disabilities, that is the work that we need to do. The data that you see is our data, and it is not well, it is a little bit different because we did have the pandemic in there. So we didn't have as many students exiting services as fast as what we would hope and would expect, which is then leading to some additional students that are still in services, which then is why we are applied for a grant to make sure we are strategically reducing the over-identification of students because our numbers got bigger. And some of it is students are still in services because they have not made the kinds of progress that they may have made should they have been in person, speaking, reading, writing, and listening on the daily.
Please go on.
So if we could go to slide 20, and I'll turn it over to Ms. Murphy.
Thank you, Ms. Wiles. So there are different pathways to dual identification. A student may be identified to receive special education services and then later identified as an EML student and receive ELD services. A student may be identified as an EML student and then later identified as a student requiring special education services. Another potential pathway may be when a student enrolls into Montgomery County Public Schools from another country. Next slide. Based upon the home language survey, the results for a student who accesses special education services in pre-K or PEP, the WEDA screener is administered for those students, and then that is when a student may be identified as an EML student. So that when they enter kindergarten, a student can access special education services, which they already were receiving, and then also begin with their ELD services. Next slide. As a part of the International Admissions and Enrollment Office, an English language proficiency assessment is administered if a student's native language is not standard American English. And then from there, a communication is sent out by email to key stakeholders from the school-based staff as well as central office staff to alert them about the student's enrollment and that they are clear to begin at the home school. This may require, what the information that is provided may indicate that the student requires special education services. And so by alerting the key staff centrally as well as at the school, they're able to begin that process as soon as the student enrolls. Next slide. In some cases, the information that we receive does not clearly identify that the student has received special education services, although that the parent may have shared information that says that their child may need something more or different or has some additional needs. So then again, the key stakeholders are notified through an email with a memorandum. There are documents that are uploaded on Synergy, and so based on the review of those documents, the team may schedule an educational management team meeting, or they may go right to a child find screening meeting, and so that way they can determine what supports may be needed for the student. Next slide. So when teachers suspect that an EML student may need additional support or suspect a potential educational disability, they engage in the multi-tiered system of supports framework, or MTSS. It grew out of a parallel movement in education to address a variety of concerns, the response to intervention for academics, as well as positive behavioral interventions and supports for behavior. It's a seamless system to address needs of the whole child. It promotes a problem-solving culture that is information-rich. So lots of data sources are being used so that as the students are in instruction, we're looking at all of the data and that their individual needs are taken into account as we make decisions for their instruction. What level of support does a student need? Next slide, please. MTSS is a proactive and preventative framework that integrates data, instruction, and intervention to maximize student achievement and support their social, emotional, and behavioral needs, and help schools to determine how to allocate and adjust the resources to achieve the desired outcomes. When engaging in the process for EMLs, the student continues to receive their English language development services. When the framework is implemented, correctly, it leads to a more efficient use of resources and staff, better organizational health. It decreases the inappropriate special education referral and placement rates. And there's a reduction in time in special education services, a reduction in student grade retention. In Montgomery County, the MTSS process is managed through Synergy. The professional learning offered to staff was developed in collaboration with the Office of School Support and Wellbeing and the Office of Curriculum and Instructional Programs, as well as the Office of Special Education and the Office of Strategic Initiatives. Once a school-based team implements the MTSS framework with an EML with fidelity and analyzes the data, it may lead to them to seek the expertise of others in the school building. And that could include your school psychologist, it could include the speech-language pathologist, counselors, social workers, special educators. And then they move forward through the EMT or the Educational Management Team meeting, and potentially if an educational disability is suspected, through the IEP team process with an initial child find meeting. So there are level 1 supports, which are for all students. And then again, looking at the data, you begin to wonder, well, if the level 1 is not working for this student, then you may move to a level 2 or tier 2 that are targeted supports. And then again, looking at the data, looking at the assessment, and determining if there's a need for tier 3 intensive levels of support. Next slide. So in terms of special education identification, as previously stated, the special education process for an EML transitions from the MTSS process to an initial child find meeting to which parents, caregivers, guardian are invited to discuss the concerns with the school team, which consists of a principal or their designee, the general education teacher, an ELD teacher, special education teacher, school psychologist, and other staff such as the counselor, speech-language pathologist, the nurse, or an interpreter. After reviewing the data, which includes input from the caregiver, parent, or guardian, the team may suspect an educational disability and recommend standardized assessments to determine the EML's strengths and areas of need. The team may refer the student to the bilingual assessment team to recommend language dominance assessments to determine in which language it is best to assess the student. The student may be assessed by a bilingual assessment team staff member or referred back to the school to do the testing with an interpreter. So the interpreter works with the speech-language pathologist and or the school psychologist to assess the student. One of the key issues is ruling out whether the student's challenges and lack of progress are solely due to the language acquisition issue, which we've talked about a little bit, or is it a bona fide educational disability that's recognized by IDEA. If the parents, caregivers, or the guardian agree to the assessments, an initial evaluation meeting is scheduled within 60 days of that child find meeting, at which the assessments are reviewed by the qualified examiners and an educational disability is made. If the IEP team, including parents, caregivers, and guardian, agree the student is identified with an educational disability in one of the 14 disability categories under IDEA. The team then has 30 days to develop the IEP, which has the student's goals, objectives, supplementary aids and services, instructional, and related services. The related services would be the OT or occupational therapy, speech and language, physical therapy, vision, hearing, depending on what the student may require. The student does not become duly identified until the parent, guardian, or caregiver assigns the initial IEP. The student's strengths and the areas of need with respect to the language acquisition are discussed at the IEP meeting. So when we talk about whether or not they need certain supports, there's also the EL plan that has been developed, and that is a part of the data that's being considered when developing the IEP. Next slide. We talked a little bit about this, but I think it's really important to highlight the number of staff members that would be involved in providing the services for a student that's duly identified. Certainly, the ELD teacher is a part of that, and so there's also the natural consultation that's going to happen between general education teachers, special education teachers, and the ELD teacher. The specially designed instruction comes as a result of the opportunities to plan and consult, as well as working with the paraeducators that may be in the general education class or in the special education classroom, depending on what the student's needs are. Again, we have the related service providers, which could be the speech language pathologist, the OT or the PT, the counselor. We also want to make sure that all the while that the evidence-based interventions are being provided by a trained staff member. So sometimes that the student may require a reading intervention, and so that we want to make sure that they have those services as well. So the integrated ELD services and specially designed instruction are not the sole domain of the ELD or special education teacher. It is the whole school team that works together to make sure that those services are provided with fidelity. Next slide, it's discussion time. We look forward to that.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a question. I think we'll get more into the MTSS model maybe when we talk about the schools and really see, when we have the example, what it truly look like in the classroom, right, for our students. My question is, if you look at slide 26, it's talking about the identification process. And what happens before the child file meeting? What communication happens between the family and the school before this meeting? What I'm getting at is, undoubtedly, this is a stressful situation for the family, right? And what are we doing to keep families informed, to set up expectation, to get on the note of a collaborative decision-making process? Or is it a collaborating decision-making process? I'm curious to know.
So prior to the child find meeting, which is a very formal process that is inclusive of the parents and caregivers, and they do have voice and agency in there. They have a whole piece that they need to complete that really says what they see at home. But before this process, they have the natural access to what happens in a classroom for any student, right? So if your student is not succeeding or not completing work or not bringing things home, there's a natural communication that already happens, both through parent view if you're on parent view, but also, you know, how the student is scoring and how they're doing, regular routine progress, plus then returning of student work, right? I think that the back to school nights this year were different, and they were done differently to be able to accommodate all families being able to attend and participate. And so that beginning of the relationship to say we're a team here, regardless of whether you're formally identified for anything, for any additional service, it is very much about knowing who the child is, what their strengths, interests, and values are, and being able to communicate with families that they're an important part of the process. Legally then, I'll let Kia jump in onto what the required pieces are as this child find meeting is happening or being planned.
Just to add to that, I mean, and I can say this because I'm not too far away from being in the school, the communication, you pick up the phone. You pick up the phone when you're seeing that the child is not achieving at a certain place and that you are implementing certain things, you're making the parent aware. You're asking the parent questions because there may be experiences or value. Maybe you have not tapped, if you will, something that this child knows that will help bridge what they're learning in school to something that they are aware of or something that they know about within their home or something that their parent may have taught them. So that communication, again, using all of the different opportunities to make sure that the communication is in the language that they may require, or, you know, if it may be a parent conference. It doesn't have to be on the scheduled MCPS calendar. That conference can happen at any time. I also mentioned the educational management team, where you have a cross-section of staff members that come together with the parent and talk about different interventions that we want to try. You come back within 6 to 8 weeks. How are we doing? Do we see any improvement? Do we need to make any adjustments? So all of that is going to happen prior to going to a referral to the special education process, unless, of course, the parent may request that they want to move forward in that direction. With regard to the Child Find meeting, there's a parent questionnaire, which they provide background information about their student. And this is not to suggest that this is all students, but we also have to recognize, particularly for international students, what have they gone through? What may have been their experience, so that we are thinking about, again, the proactive pieces. We have social workers in our county, so that sometimes we may ask for a consult with the social workers. We're really looking at all the supports that are provided within MCPS. We have the parent community coordinators, or PCCs, that help bridge the gap as well.
Who informed the family their legal rights?
Absolutely. So the procedural safeguards, those are provided in multiple languages, and I will tell you that it is our responsibility to make sure that we review that with parents. That can happen before the meeting. When I say before, I don't mean like right at the beginning of the meeting. Before the meeting, because those that booklet is sent with the documents during the meeting, and then after the meeting. It is not unusual, and I'm taking myself out of my current role, but just when I was a school-based teacher, when I was an administrator, sitting down to explain those processes with them, giving them the name and the contact in the resolution and compliance unit, because sometimes it's a lot to take in when you don't know the acronyms, you don't know that academic language. It has nothing to do with just not having the language, but really understanding, what does this mean? What is this saying? What does this mean for my child? Sorry, I get a little passionate.
Right.
What
I love to see.
it is taking the time to make sure that because it's very nuanced, making sure that you understand what your rights are as a parent, what you want for your child, and then they can make a decision based upon that information. We always need their permission to move forward. So the team may recommend assessments, but then the parent must give us their authorization in order to move forward.
In special education, we talk about the least restricted environment, right, for the student to receive. Are those explained to the parents? And when, if that happens, when does it happen?
So the least restrictive environment discussion happens at every meeting where we're talking about placement for a student. So specifically during annual reviews, at the initial IEP meeting, we go through the whole process. We look at where students are in their present levels. We look at what goals they need to work on, what accommodations they need. And then we talk about services. What do we need to give this student? How many hours? Who needs to provide the services? And then we talk about where those services should take place. And that's the least restrictive environment discussion.
Do they know before they even come to these meetings? Because some families or some, I have heard and seen people, they do their own research, right? And they have in their mind what kind of services or things or environment that were best for their students. But that might not be the least restricted environment. So I'm wondering, can education happen even before we sit down in a meeting to talk about the service? Because what we don't want to see is when we are sitting down, we are already having the potential having an adversary relationship, because our understanding of how special education is provided is, right?
Yeah, so some conversation can be had before the meeting, but what we can't do is predetermine. So it's really important that at the IEP meeting with the parent, the special educator, the general educator, the school psychologist, anyone who is providing services to the student, that they have that discussion while they're looking at data, while they're looking at what the student's needs are, while they're looking at where, when I say where, inside general education, outside general education classes, the services can be provided. So we don't make that determination until that meeting. But during that meeting, we certainly do have a very robust discussion with parents about this. These are the services that, based on the discussion of the team throughout the meeting, the IEP can be implemented. And if the parent at that time has questions or disagrees or wants to see, what does this look like, then they certainly, we certainly accommodate that request. we can do a tour of a school that provides those services. IEPs are fluid documents. So if a decision is made on Monday, that doesn't mean that that's the decision until the student exits that grade at the end of the school year. Teams come back regularly if there's additional data, if there are changes in what the student's needs are, if the parent requests a meeting, if the school team requests a meeting, or if there's a need to change those services throughout the school year. But it's important that prior to that meeting, we don't steer a parent in either direction because we haven't had that full conversation with the whole team.
I understand that. I think general education about, parents' legal rights and the approaches, how we do, like the least restricted, that's the guiding principles. I think these are good basic education, not specific to any individual cases, but these are basic good education for our parents to have, so that when we get into a 45-minute meeting under, difficult circumstances with a heavy topic, with things to do, and the more knowledge, background information, understanding about the structure, I think will help those conversations go more smoothly.
Absolutely, and that's being done. Our Parent Resource Center is where...
Let's talk about that in a bit.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we do that work through parent workshops where we are informing parents on what their rights are, on what services look like, what to expect in an IEP meeting. So we absolutely have opportunities throughout the school year for parents to participate in those workshops to get that information.
Can I make a request, a data request, that I would like to see the different workshops that we offer for our special education families, or if EML families, and what topic they are, and if we have participation data, like how many people register or show up, that would be very helpful.
Certainly, we can get that information for you. I will just put a plug in and say we have a wonderful website that has all of the information on the current workshops, and I believe we have recorded some of the workshops. That information will be posted. Also, our Special Education Citizen Advisory Committee that meets monthly. We, CCAC, yes. We post our agendas and each meetings. We actually post a meeting online, so that is another opportunity where we share information, provide information, give parents an opportunity to, parents and guardians an opportunity to ask questions of our staff about the IEP process, and that information is available on the website.
I'm particularly interested to see our outreach to younger or newer families, right? Because I think as people are in this process, along the way they pick up knowledges, and but for the people who are young or new, or English might not be their first language, and we were at, Ms. Harris and I were at the International Admission Office 2 weeks ago, and had a wonderful tour. I want to give them a shout out. They take about more than 4,000 cases a year, right, of new student enrollment there. So I'm thinking about these families there. If special education conversation need to happen, there might be a big gap of knowledge about system, about a lot of things. So yeah, I will be interested in that data.
If I can just piggyback on to what you're saying, I feel like Montgomery County has amazing services for children, and it is a draw for families who have students with special needs from other communities to actually come here. And that is a blessing and a curse, because what we're trying very, very hard as a group to do is to provide services to children, right? And so by doing that, you have to identify what's unique about the child and actually what they need. Programs have been developed because that's a way to co-locate resources, right? And so we don't want to fit children into programs. We want to provide services for children, whether it may be a program or part of a program or in their home school. I think that the concept of saying what all of the options are, all of the variety of options throughout the system, you have families who know very little about what's available here in Montgomery County, and then you have families who are shopping for both our services and the services outside of the county. And our goal in all of that, that's all true, and that's great that families are advocating for their children, but if we can continue to say, this is about your child, their unique needs, and how we can provide those services, whether it's, the location of those services may be determined by the severity and the needs, but we don't want to advertise programs as, hey, we have an autism program. Every autistic child needs to go into an autism program, because that's not simply not the case, right? And so I think what would be helpful as we're talking to families is keeping it very specific about what the student's needs are and what they're seeing and how to help that student grow and learn. And working towards how do we create those opportunities with families to talk about what options are available.
Thank you for that.
I just want to add this on because what you've said is very important and passionate for me, is to really be conscious that they are services. It's not a program, because children go in and out of general education. So really a mindset around services as opposed to a program, as Peggy was describing, because what happens is that we believe that we have to go in to a certain program and it has to be done a certain way, when in fact the strengths and needs of the child are different. They may have the same disability, but their needs look different.
So I think this is such a good conversation, and I think this is the conversation to have with every family too. If they can understand that even before the child find meeting, and I think that will help the conversation along the way. Mrs. Harris?
Yeah, thank you. Just kind of going back and clarifying again for the thousands of viewers out there, we are talking about sort of an entree point into this process of evaluation and determination being a child find meeting, which could be which could come about by, a recommendation of a teacher or staff member in a school, or you mentioned parents as well, can raise concerns. And that first child find meeting is just what exactly?
So in a child find meeting, if the team has met prior to for an educational management team, all of the notes from those meetings would be considered, because that shares with the team what interventions have been tried, what has been successful and maybe not so successful. The parent guardian information is considered once they filled out the parent questionnaire, and that talks about their developmental process, their experiences with their child, what may be outside of the purview of school, what they may have experienced, for example, if it was the death of a parent or if they were hospitalized at a young age. And then it also asks the parent to talk to us about what they see for their child. So in other words, is their child artistic? Does their child love nature? So they give us some of those details as well. And then we ask in that questionnaire, what do you think that the school can do for you and for your child? So that we have some glimpses on whether or not they may need additional resources for the family as well as for the student academically. So the team is going to consider that information as well as the academic assessments, as well as the day-to-day schoolwork that has been completed. With that, we're looking to see if we see any patterns of those strengths and areas of need to determine whether or not we suspect a disability.
Okay, so that meeting is just where concerns have been raised or requests have been made to convene it, and then the people are coming together to share their observations and data and have a focused conversation based on that about whether we need to move forward to the next step.
So if we suspect the disability at that meeting, we would recommend whatever assessments may be appropriate. So educational, psychological, it could be also speech and language or an occupational therapy, physical therapy. It all depends on what has been reviewed. But at that meeting, we would make the recommendation, should we believe that a disability is suspected, and then ask for authorization.
And you mentioned that within 60 days or 2 months of that child find meeting, if it is determined that services may well be needed, they have up to 60 days to do whatever additional evaluation is required to identify what services then do we need.
So then we would, by 60 days, we would go over those evaluations. And so that you'll see in those evaluations where the strengths lie, where the areas of need are. From there, we go over those assessments so the parent caregiver is able to see them. They'll get them prior to the meeting, but we talk through them. They're able to ask those questions. And I will say to you that I work diligently with supervisors to share with parents, bring somebody with you if you can. Write your questions down ahead of time if you have questions. They don't need to provide that to us ahead, but that's just to help them get mentally prepared because it's emotional when you're talking about your child. So we go through those results, and then depending on whether or not we find the child eligible, we would then reconvene in 30 days to develop the IEP. It could be possible after all those evaluations, we learn more about the student, certainly, but that we don't determine that the child meets the criteria for an educational disability.
And so this is not, I mean, this is a process that can take quite some time. From first in identifying the potential need for services to actually being at a place where the system can provide those services based on an IEP. It sounds like 60 days and 30 days, so it can take quite some time.
Yeah, I wanted to explain the why behind that. So when Ms. Hewlett talked about the assessments that they do for EML students, it's a short 20-minute assessment. In special education, as Ms. Murphy said, there can be multiple assessments that are conducted because we're required to assess a student in every area that we suspect that they may have a disability. So if we think that they have issues with fine motor, we need to do an OT. If we think that they have articulation concerns, we have to do a speech and language assessment. And so that takes time. The 60 days is what is in the law, in the federal law. Excuse me. So what we're looking at is multiple evaluators having to spend time and do assessments that may take multiple sessions because we don't want to overload a student. So if you do have a student that is getting a battery of testing from different evaluators, I want the best out of the student when I assess them. So when the psychologist comes in, if it takes 3 or 4 days to test, and I'm the special educator, I don't want to test that student the same week that they did that psychological assessment because of the fatigue of, spending an hour in a room with the psychologist to do this intensive assessment. The other part of that is as the process is going, the educators are able to collect data, and that data is used in that initial evaluation meeting so that we can determine if a student does have a disability. So it's not, and as well as doing observations, formal observations of the student now that you have said, we think that they may have a disability that qualifies them for special education. So the why behind the 60 days is the amount of work that's done in that time frame. Now, we do have some students that may come into the district. We've had students that have come in through the international office that very clearly had some disabling condition. And what we've done is we've referred them to the school's 504 team in order for them to evaluate them. So if a parent comes in with a known diagnosis, they can more quickly get 504 services and accommodations and still go through the IEP referral process. So they can get those accommodations while they're being evaluated for special education.
And I'll just close with it's not as though we identify a need and are withholding while we're testing. So there's work being done with the child and with the family all along in the MTSS system. They're getting interventions that are natural and occurring right there in the classroom or even in pullouts. They're just not getting a formalized set of agreed upon, here's the service they need and a goal that's set for them. So I don't want people to think, well, we know what they need and we've got to wait to prove it. It really is. The data helps us to identify what additional beyond what we're doing in the school to meet their learning needs does this child need based upon a disability?
Yeah, because I know from having talked to many parents that the length of the process can be a significant source of anxiety and frustration because they see their child not progressing or not being able to access learning while that process is going on. So I know it is lengthy. And I did appreciate, Dr. Pugh, you mentioning sort of the difference. So we have sort of a very wide array of community knowledge about the programs that we have available. And something that I've heard for well over a decade is that because of the wealth of special education services provided in Montgomery County, parents do come here for that purpose only. They choose to come here instead of any of the 23 other school systems in Maryland, or in maybe some of the local jurisdictions. And so you have some parents who have that level of knowledge, and they are, as you said, kind of shopping for services, and then other families who have none of that. And so how are we, I guess, making sure that given the number of seats in some of our specialized programs are not unlimited, and how are we making sure that we are being really, truly equitable in providing those services, and that it not just be, the savvy parent who really wants their child in that enhanced SES program because they know, it's self-contained and they're going to get all these direct services and all these one-on-one supports. And then another student who may need those services, but their family's what do we do to try to ensure true equity of access?
Yeah, thank you for the question. One at a time is what I would say. Each family and reviewing what their circumstances and situations are. It really is hugely student dependent. I think, to your point, there's not limited seats in special education. We are by law required to provide services to children, and it doesn't matter. There's no excuse. You can't say, I don't have staff, I don't have money, I don't have this. Once you've identified that they are required a service, we are legally obligated to do that above all else. That is our mission, and so it's one of the misnomers, I guess, the myths of special education. That it's you have to know and be able to navigate this very complex and confusing and emotional landscape in order to access the very best for your children. Really, honestly, if we're doing it right, working with the school teams, the teachers, those and parents and caregivers around what that child's unique needs are, then educating as we go through the process and trying things to see if they're working, showing progress on specific goals based upon what is selected by the team. And it is a journey. It's not a fix and then, no longer needing services. It's definitely a long-term relationship between the school and the family and the child to make sure that what we're providing is meeting the needs of the student based on what their disability is. And so, how do we work with families? We actually have the Parent Family Resource Center. We have the Special Ed Citizens Advisory Committee meetings, and some of those are where parents meet other parents like them, right? And so the beauty of that is you have a parent who's been here or who is going through the same thing that you are doing, because sometimes that is the very scary piece, the thing that causes anxiety and your worries. And the other thing I would say is communicate to the school, right? As a parent, communicate what your concerns, fears, worries are, to be able to learn and get that advocacy and knowledge. And I'll mention one other person in our district, Winter Bingham, in the Office of the Deputy Superintendent. She's also a special education liaison who is not part of the special education team, but who can actually advise families. She can listen and spend the time to help and understand. And so we want families to advocate and be able to have the information. We want them to work with us so that it is not inequitable in who has access to what.
But I do appreciate what you said, is that we are legally obligated. But I think we all know that there is a huge shortage of qualified special educators. And, some of our highest need special education programs, that is very hard work. And getting people that do want to do that work is hard. And I've talked to principals at those schools who say they'll go through a long process. They'll finally hire a paraeducator. They come and they leave in a day or two because they see what it's really like. So it is one thing to say we're legally required to, but we know if you don't have the people, you can't provide the services. So I know I've also talked to elementary school principals who have had expanded PEP programs in their schools, and they're like, I don't have the staff for it. And they say in the central office's response will be, well, we gave you an allocation, but an allocation is not a person. Mm-hmm. And when they go through multiple rounds of trying to hire the staff that they need, and people come and go, and then they leave quickly because of many factors. So that's the reality. And so how do we navigate that process? Because we hear all the time from parents who say, my kid has a 504, they have an IEP, they're not getting their services.
Yeah, well.
And they're not lying, I don't think.
Yeah, we need to know that if they're not getting their services. So to your point, resource scarcity is a reality. I mean, we understand that. And it is coming at a time when children's needs are greater than they've ever been, right? We're seeing a multitude of needs, social, emotional, mental health, as well as learning needs. And so, the approach to that is we have to serve 80% of our children, basically, in the general education setting. That is the goal, is to be able to meet their needs in general education. And so that means, what does that look like in a classroom for a student who has needs, with or without an IEP? And how do we use the resources that we do have in a school to make sure that their needs are met? This is where you'll find you have a variety of, a resource teacher who has an affinity for a particular student, becomes part of their support team in the school. They're not on paper anywhere, but it's a matter of trying to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the students with all staff. And this is where that specialty program piece becomes a barrier, right? Because we find that people want to go into, or think that they want to go into programs because they have different resources. They are allocated different pieces and different supports. When in the reality is, we might be able to provide those services in addition to what they're getting in their grade level classroom. So in the middle of this shift from program to services, and where the services might exist and who might be able to provide them within an individual school, there is no doubt schools are having to be very creative about it. And it does create this tension, this push-pull about, but they're identified special education, and so there's a ratio that needs to happen over here, and very mathematical. But the bottom line is, it doesn't matter that we don't have a teacher in the classroom. We still have to provide the services. We will be making up compensatory services if we aren't able to provide them in the regular classroom. So we cannot use the rationale that we don't have, or we don't have enough. We have to figure out best ways to utilize those resources we do have to meet the needs of the student. And sometimes that means reaching across the aisle to people who aren't typically service providers to be able to meet the needs of the students.
Yeah. And I do appreciate that, and so trying to contextualize this. So I'm in my 40th month on the board, 3 years and 3 months, but so that means part of 4 academic years, and certainly in my time of service on the board. But of course, I can't speak beyond that because I wasn't on the board before. I'm hearing significantly more concerns this academic year from families about disruptions in their child's classrooms, from students who have apparently significant needs that are, resulting in violent behavior, and how the schools are trying to manage those needs inside the general education classrooms. And as you said, we're seeing more students with more needs than we ever have before. But it is a pressure point and a pain point for families and staff and students. And as we struggle to find the right balance, and it is difficult for us as on the board to know how, I mean, we simply kind of, share what we're hearing and push it along to the appropriate office and departments and staff. But, when we see teachers leaving or having to go out on long-term leave because they've been injured multiple times, it is a concern for ours when we say, what are we trying to do and who are we trying to serve and how are we really trying to balance the needs of everybody to keep classrooms efficiently moving and teaching and learning happening. So that's just kind of a comment and an observation for me is what I've been seeing and hearing this year, which is again, different from my experience before. But also, I know I have seen it, and it's been, I don't think I've seen it this academic year, maybe last calendar year. The board received a memo that identified the location of our programs, special education services and programs throughout the system. But I know things, aren't, they're not stagnant. Things change, programs move or grow or shrink or whatever. And if you mentioned, Ms. Wild, there you have the website. Does that website identify, is it continuously updated as to where programs are located and how someone can explore a program they think might be applicable or meet a need?
Yes, on the website, there's a description of all of the services that we provide, as well as an interactive map that shows you where those services are located throughout the district.
Okay.
So I want to do it for the audience outside, audience who are watching. So if you go to MCPS website, in the search bar, you type special education, and you will take you to the special education page. Am I correct? And then there are the announcement of the CCAP, there's the announcement of the Family Support Center, and then there are section called services. Okay, so and I think and a good map to about sections, that's a map to navigate this web page. So that's where family can go for information. Ms. Harris, in the interest, what was that?
There's a lot there.
There's a lot there, exactly. Ms. Harris, in the interest of time, can we go to highlight a school, invite our schools to join us for the next section?
So to close that section there, I don't want, I think the point about behaviors, it's important to point out that those are happening across special ed, general ed, and EL, and they are not unique to just special education students. And it is a challenge for our schools. There's a very clear process within special education should a student have behavior goals. There's assessments, there's goal setting, there's tools, there's training, but there aren't those things for those students, or many of those things for students who are not receiving special education services. So that's a thing that we're going to continue to need to build the capacity of our teachers as these needs of students continuing to come to us change. And so with that, we'll go to the next slide. School profile.
So we're going to talk about the work that's being done at Sequoia Elementary School. And in the audience, we have Ms. Katie Bettis, who's an instructional specialist in the Department of Special Education Services in our specially designed instruction unit, who has been doing this work. I'm going to present this information, and should you have some points of clarifications on specifics of what we've been doing, she's certainly here to answer some of those questions. So Sequoia Elementary School has received collaborative professional learning from the Department of English Learner and Multilingual Education and the Department of Special Education Services to support 51 dually identified students in grades K to 5. Over 95% of the EMLs at Sequoia are Hispanic students. Students receive special education services in the Learning Center, which is a self-contained special education classroom outside of general education environment, or in the homeschool model, which is inside the general education classroom with their non-disabled peers. So a student could have any combination of some self-contained classes and some classes with their non-disabled peers. Students may take their academic classes. I'm sorry, my computer is making all kinds of noises. Apologies. You can go to the next slide. Thank you.
Can I ask just a quick clarifying question?
Sure.
So looking here at the slide before, it looks like there's a mix of data from a couple of different years. In the average class size box, is that, what academic year are we looking at there?
Yeah. This year.
So this is the current data on the dashboard.
Okay.
So this should be the most current data pool.
Thank you.
Right, it is available for all schools.
And you said 51 dually identified students in the population? Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
When we look at this chart, there is one box that least restricted environment, and then there are ABC. What does that mean?
Sure. So the ABC, it represents the different percentages of time inside or outside of general education. Most students are in LREA, which means more than 80% of their school day is spent inside general education where they're learning with their non-disabled peers. LREB is what we might call a combination. So you may have some time in self-contained or outside of general education, or pull out, and some time inside general education. And the percentage is really for like our data purposes, the state's purposes, to see where we have students. So those students are 40 to 79% of the time inside general education. Anything below 40% is LREC, which means the student is primarily learning outside of general education.
Most restrictive.
Well, that's not the most restrictive.
So the orange bar, can we go back one slide, please? So we can all see what we are referring to. So that box we're talking about is the least restricted environment. So the orange bar is 66.7%.
66.7%.
What does this bar represent?
Sure, so that means that the 66.7% of the students with IEPs in Sequoia are inside general education the majority of their school day.
Okay.
So that's not just the 51 duly identified, that's all of the
All
students
special.
identified at Sequoia.
Which is the 18.8% of the
their
school
totals.
population.
Correct.
And then, so the gray bar, column C, is the students who spend LREC most of their time in special programs.
Correct.
Okay.
And so at Sequoia, because they have a learning center, which is for students who have some very specific academic and or behavioral needs that cannot be met inside of general education, they have a higher number of students than a school that doesn't have a learning center. They have a higher number of students who are in LREC.
Thank you for the clarification.
Certainly.
And I just want to say thank you for, in the gender box, there's an X.
So is this a school, focus school? Or no? It's have 56.6% farm rate.
I'm not sure
You're
if
not
it's a
sure.
focus school.
Okay, because I'm looking at the class size. Those are very good class size.
Yeah,
Very good. Okay, we can move on.
Next slide.
Can I just quickly interrupt? Yes, they are a focus school.
Right, because I see they have academic support services at their school, so,
Thanks.
okay, I was wondering. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hewitt. Using data from the WIDA access scores, we know EML students demonstrate relative strengths in listening as compared to speaking. Similarly, reading is a relative strength when compared to writing. Essentially, our students need support generating language while speaking and writing. When a person develops language, either a new language or a new language structure due to a language disability, first they listen, then they experiment with speaking. Research has been clear, oracy practice and opportunities improves literacy outcomes for all students, but specifically for our duly identified EML students who receive special education services. Next slide. While oral language is the ability to understand and express oneself in a language, oracy is a subset of oral language that students need to meet the academic and content objectives in a classroom. These are the skills students need to demonstrate what they know, think, and can do related to text. Developing oracy skills helps students to learn how to reason, use evidence, listen and respond, express ideas, deliver a message, organize their thoughts into speech, and prioritize ideas and thoughts in language. So focusing on oracy helps students to gain the confidence they need in the classroom, and increasing these skills translates into improving literacy skills. Next slide. This school year at Sequoia, there have been 2 sessions delivered to professional staff during staff meetings, and a third is planned for later this spring. The sessions focus on how teachers can embed language acquisition and oral language development into daily literacy instruction. After each session, the Sequoia leadership team, which includes the reading specialist, the ELD team leader, the Learning Center coordinator, and the SDT, staff development teacher, thank you, Dr. Pugh, has facilitated collaborative planning time for teachers to incorporate the learning from those sessions. Next slide. In session 1, the focus was language acquisition strategies that build students' oral language skills. Sentence patterning charts is a more structured word bank where instead of an assortment of words, the students are given the building blocks to generate a complete sentence. You can see in the pictures the 2 students on the left used embedded scaffolding of the color coding to build a complete sentence, while the student on the left was able to use the model to write her own sentence.
And we're sorry we had to cover their pictures. They were so cute, just the smiles that they had on there.
Next slide. In this slide, you see the use of process grids. Process grids collect information throughout the unit and support students' ability to build connections among text and ideas. Notice in the 2nd grade chart, the teacher used sticky notes to support students while writing. They can employ the same color coding as in the sentence patterning chart to support their writing, or pull off these sticky notes to use it as a word bank. Next slide. In the 1st grade, the class created a process grid to compare 2 stories and then the sentence patterning chart to write about them. Next slide. After the first session of professional learning, the team recognized that teachers needed tools for embedding oral language opportunities into daily instruction. To support this, the team focused on 3 language routines, and the word routine is used very intentionally. Just as teachers teach the morning routine or the dismissal routine or routines in the lunchroom, we must explicitly teach and reinforce these communication routines in the classroom for our duly identified students. So in order to be intentional in addressing the language acquisition needs of these students, DELMI and DSES have provided support so that teachers can effectively embed these routines into instruction. Teachers consider language structure, vocabulary, and dialogue as they create lessons for their students so that they can ensure that oracy is at the center of instruction. Next slide. 3 additional strategies are part of the routines Sequoia teachers use for their duly identified students. Paraphrasing, or asking students to restate what they heard, requires them to use synonyms, synthesize information, or organize language. It allows multiple entry points into a classroom discussion. Students with emergent language skills can share with the language they have, and every student can participate in some way. The group can listen to the paraphrasing and then confirm or revise the paraphrase by signaling a thumbs up or verbally confirming. Picture retells provide students the opportunity to use pictures from the text or related text or props to support with retelling a story. And finally, primary language retell is used for EML students to learn and take chances developing language. There needs to be psychological safety around language learning. One way you can do that is by honoring and celebrating the student's primary language. First, you want to model, and if you speak a language other than English, model with that language. Students should be encouraged to choose a part of a story or content and tell about it in their language. They can use English when there are words that they know in English, and always thank them for sharing their language with you. So all of these are different strategies we use just to begin the process of developing oracy skills so that students can be familiar with, comfortable with the language, and in turn develop those literacy skills. Next slide. So we talked about some of the challenges and considerations that we have when we work with our dually identified students. We've talked about over and under identification. Under identification sometimes occurs, as Ms. Hewlett said, because we do want to make sure that we're giving students the opportunity to make progress. And so sometimes the team may take longer to make that referral to the Child Find team. One thing I did want to point out when we talk about MTSS, those structures are in place, but they are not we cannot substitute MTSS for a Child Find referral. So if we know that we suspect a disability, we have to move forward with Child Find. We can't delay the process if we do truly suspect that a student has a disability. So it is really a fine line between over-identifying, identifying, under-identifying a student with, who is learning the English language. Excuse me. The ability to accurately identify language acquisition is, needs versus an educational disability we've talked about during the presentation. It does continue to be something that our offices are working on, as well as we're working on it through our grant so that we can develop some systemic professional learning on how to make that distinction even before the IEP team becomes involved, so that we can ensure that we are ruling out language and not making it part of a student's disability. As we discussed, our students with significant cognitive disabilities who are also EMLs face some very significant challenges because challenges with language is part of their profile. And so making that distinction at the time that we identify them is challenging, but also instructing the student who, by the sheer fact that they have this significant cognitive disability, poses challenges with instruction. So that's when we do use multisensory approaches. We use picture boards, we use speech to text, we use different modes of communication so that those students can actually access instruction. In a district of 160,000 students with 22,000 special education students and 32,000 EML students, professional learning for all teachers is challenging. But it's a commitment of our offices. And it's not just the professional learning that we do with our ELD teachers and our special educators, but it's the general education teachers who, as with Sequoia, over 65% of those students are in general education setting. So it's very important, and we're targeting how we can inform, provide professional learning to our general educators who come out of teaching programs and they have not had the kind of preparation for this population of students. So professional learning is really key to ensuring that we're providing the services to these students. And then finally, students who cannot test out of the WIDA access due to the nature and severity of their disability is a challenge that we face, where you do see some students who continually test at level 1, level 2, because of the assessment, where that poses challenges for us, because then we need to determine which services really does a student need. Next slide. And we want to just provide a list of some of the parent resources that we have. We spoke about the Parent Resource Center, our special education parent liaison, Dr. Warner Bingham. We also had the opportunity, Ms. Murphy and I, to talk to some parents who are involved in PTAs that have their own special education committee within the PTA. And then our CCAC that meets monthly. Additionally, we work with several advocacy groups to support the needs of our students. We refer our parents to those advocacy groups. So we do have a wealth of resources for parents that we continue to spread the word so that they have access to the information that they need so that they can advocate for their children. Next slide. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I appreciate very much on slide 37, you mentioned at Sequoia, they do primary language retail. I think formation of students' language asset. I'm very appreciative of our school district having that approach. I have a few questions, some clarification questions, some understanding about process question. So a lot of parents ask me, where is the special education resource, parent resource center, and how to use the parent resource center? Can you tell our parents?
I'm sorry, the physical location of it?
Yeah, physical location.
So it's at the
how to-
Lynbrook Center, which is Bethesda, I believe. That's where it is. Mary Beth Montserranis is the person, and so she is accessible by email, can arrange times to meet with parents. She also will come to the parent. So it's not that they have to come to Bethesda, because that may not be convenient for people. She uses all of the available resources in terms of language to make sure that there is the open and honest communication, and on occasion, she will attend an IEP meeting. So the resources, and I think one of the things we are actually looking at and working on, because we've gotten the feedback that they may not be as accessible as we had intended or hoped. So we are looking at ways to use WhatsApp as another way to communicate with our parents. So that's something that's under, I guess, evaluation, if you will, to figure out how that could, how we could use it similarly situated to some of the other ways that we're communicating with parents.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad that Ms. Hewitt is here, because I'm looking at Sequoia Elementary School and the strategies they use in working with the students, and I'm also trying to understand our EML MTSS system. So if you can help me see how does that happen in the classroom, like during a school's academic day for a student? Maybe screening is not that day, but how does prevention system, progress monitoring, and data come into play? Help us visualize it.
Before she starts, to clarify,
Okay.
MTSS is a school-wide system for
Okay.
any student of any type.
Okay.
And so MTSS is what the whole school does tier one, almost all, that all students receive, right? And then based on a variety of things, you may or may not be an EML student or a special education student to access tier two, right? It might be reading interventions, right? It might be something that you need additional support on in mathematics with or without a disability. And so all of them, that's a main framework for all of them. Then each set of services is also plugged into that total system. They're just not accessible by all students.
Okay.
That makes sense. So
That
it's not
does
a
make
separate.
sense. That does make sense.
Okay.
Right, so I want to see how
What it looks
it's
like.
play with ELD, right? Then how does this merge with our special education? And how it happened. I'm a classroom teacher here. I'm a student in this classroom. What does it mean that we have this triangle right here? What does it mean? Yeah.
So Sequoia Elementary was the model, the example used here. Really, this project that we are embarking on / continuing to embark on at Sequoia was around how we provide specially designed instruction for our students receiving EML services, but just specially designed instruction at Sequoia because of the nature of the Learning Center at their school and how language development should be provided to all students where special education services do not take precedence over English language development services. And so that's the message not only at Sequoia Elementary, but it is the message across the district. So if I were an elementary school content teacher, my day would look like welcoming my students, all of them. My day might have my English language development teacher coming in for a period to co-teach. If we were able to co-plan on a lesson, they might be able to co-teach. If that is not the program model being used in that particular grade level or in that particular classroom, the ELD teacher might come in, plug into the classroom, and provide language development that is in alignment with the content being taught. So it's not, I'm going to pull you aside and give you a grammar lesson that has nothing to do with the content that is being instructed, but the teachers are planning together. They know that we are working on prime and composite numbers in math. There is some language that is necessary for that instruction. So the ELD teacher might come in and front load some vocabulary, and what front loading means is giving a preview ahead of time and building up that student's background knowledge to be able to access the content during the tier 1 instruction, which is being provided by the content teacher. You will see, you should see scaffolds happening throughout the day because our emergent multilingual learners may need certain scaffolds. So you should see the content teacher providing that, but the English language development teacher, that's their jam, right? So that's what they're really going to come in and support the student, whether it's pictures, whether it's vocab cards, whether it's the sentence patterning chart, which is a Be Glad strategy that our team worked with at Sequoia to show all teachers how they could build out language. It doesn't have to be a daunting task, but if students start to understand that sentences fall in a particular pattern, hence the sentence patterning chart, they are able to then teach the students the cadence of the language, the parts of speech, but while doing it in the context of the instruction. If I were a secondary teacher, as an English language development teacher, you would either see me in my course that is English language development, and that's typically linked to the English course that is at that grade level. And so that course has, one, it's at a slower rate in terms of having more time in a day to go through the daily lesson, but you will see again those language development structures in place. So that's tier 1. Everyone has access to grade level content instruction with the necessary supports. Then when you use that data, the data collected, you then decide after a period of time if students are not necessarily meeting those benchmarks with those appropriate scaffolds, then you might need to implement a tier 2. And as Dr. Pugh explained, that's not just for EMLs, it's not just for students receiving special education services, that is for everyone. So in a tier 2 intervention of sorts, you might see a mix of EMLs, native English speakers, and students receiving special education services, and duly coded. You might have all of that, depending on what the data says, and you would provide an intervention. There are some purchased interventions that we have for specific things. When it comes to at the elementary level, we currently have some interventions for comprehension, for EMLs specifically, and the special education team can talk about whatever other interventions they have. But we typically follow, what the data tells us in order to say, does this need to be a tier 2 intervention? Does it need to be a tier 3 intervention? The higher you go in your tiers, the lower percentage of students we should see needing those services, that level of support. But we do have students who need tier 3 intervention. A lot of what's different about the tiers is number of students in that group, number of dosage, like how often they meet, the intensity of the intervention, et cetera. So again, it's really student specific. It's driven by the data. Grade level, tier 1, everybody gets that first instruction from their content teacher with the supports necessary. Tier 2 might involve grade level curricula, just going a little deeper, and or an intervention, and tier 3, a strategic intervention, and tier 3 would be an even deeper intervention.
Who delivers those tier 2, tier 3 interventions?
It's a combination. It's an excellent question because there is the long debate, right? If you're in tier 2, is that a program? And now does somebody else do it? So the classroom teacher delivers all of the tier 1, but a classroom teacher can also deliver tier 2 in terms of a small group, particularly in reading. If they're talking about language, they can deliver parts of tier 2. Partway through tier 2, it might need to be pull out. Right, if you consider it with bands at the top of it, and that pullout would either be by the trained interventionist or by the ELD teacher or by the special educator or whoever the service provider is for that. And then tier 3 is definitely a pullout.
So typically, how long, when you say monitor progress, data-driven decision, typically, like how long does it take for a student's case to be elevated from tier 1 to tier 2 or to tier 3? What kind of timeline? Do we wait for state standardized testing, or is it ongoing classroom observation, right? And who's in charge of that? So is the classroom teacher that decide these things, and how is it decided?
I'll start and let you fill in the specifics. So no, we absolutely don't wait for the state tests because that's at the end of the year and is already finished. But we do use information from the previous year if there's previous year information available to say how was that child proceeding. Generally, the way that this starts in terms of services would be in your collaborative planning when you're meeting with your grade level team and you're looking at the progress of students on whatever measure it was, whatever common assessment that they just took or work that they just completed aligned to a standard, and then determining, okay, do we need to regroup and who needs to regroup? So it kind of happens as a large process, and then you have by the end of the first marking period, is a student making progress or not making progress. The challenge to answering your question is that while the standards do not change throughout a year, standards are addressed at different times throughout the year. So it's not as though you're taking the same standard that you're working on in September and working on it for the entire year in all courses and contents. So it's an ongoing process, but it starts with the teacher understanding his or her data. Those processes, my understanding is the instructional leadership team of the school determines the where, when, how, and who is in those meetings to make determinations about how students are progressing. And I'll let Ms. Murphy share specific details since she was just recently there.
Just quickly, it's also very student-specific, because when we look at our EML students and our students who receive special education services, they do, many of them do learn at a reduced pace.
Yeah.
And so when you move from Tier 1 to Tier 2 or to Tier 3, we really have to look at what is that student's unique needs. And we're not, in many respects, we're not measuring their rate of progress with their non-disabled peers' rate of progress. So where we think a student who doesn't have an IEP, who isn't EML, should be at the end of the first quarter, isn't necessarily where a student with an IEP and who certainly is duly identified would be. So it really has to be a student-specific analysis.
Are there something to add?
What I was going to say is sometimes what you'll see is that there is measurable progress, but it may not necessarily. So, for example, how we color code things. So maybe they haven't moved from red to orange, but within that red band, there's substantial progress. And so when a team meets and discusses a student, they establish that timeline for when they're going to come back and look. So the rate of progress, as Ms. Wiles had shared, is individualized, but we're looking at how they are doing in comparison to themselves.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, planning and meeting were mentioned quite a number of times, right? And I also understand each school's is different. Secondary and elementary school might be different in how we do planning. But as a system, do we have some guidelines of how often our classroom teacher, for example, in the elementary schools, will meet with our ELD teacher or our special ed teachers, or in the secondary levels, how our content area teachers will meet with your teams, right? The teachers in ELD. Do we have some general guidelines or?
Yes, we do. It's funny enough, we have master scheduler meetings happening right now. One happened this morning, and I had some representatives from my team go to the master schedulers meeting just to outline all of our guidance as they take into account how they start scheduling students. That's for the secondary level. But it really boils down to how an administrator or an administrative team builds their master schedule. And so the guidance is to ensure that you have your service providers able to attend as many planning sessions as possible. So if they're if they support the sixth grade department, you want to make sure that they have off during the planning time with the sixth grade department. So they're a part of those meetings, not seen as a person who, if I get to talk to you, I get to talk to you, but actually a part of the team. And so that's K-12. I think that I safely say that that's both of our offices' guidance. And so it's all about that master planning, master schedule, how it's built. And yes. Now, the reality is when you have a singleton or a person who's not even there for a full time, we have some 0.6, 0.8 FTE ELD teachers. There's no way that they can attend planning and provide the services to the students when they're not even full-time or they're the only one. They cannot attend every grade level, et cetera. And so we say that within reason, you have those instances, but teams are still expected to plan with the ELD teacher. And so that means, maybe we have a system where we do our planning and we send you our planning document so that the ELD teacher knows what objectives are going to be covered in the following week, where the high leverage language points are, and so that they can plan accordingly. So there are systems set up and structures, but it's about continuous communication amongst the service providers and the content teams.
Yeah, because I'm really trying to wrap my brain around it, right? I can take an elementary school level, 4 levels. 5 or 6 grades. I'm trying to see, and secondary levels, then different content area, different subjects, right? Different grade level and language. So,
Yes.
So I know our staff are all trying to do such a good job to service our students, and I truly appreciate and understand the complexity of the issue and system.
Yes, thank you. And I know our teachers would appreciate hearing that you understand how difficult the job can be, but how important it is to make sure that the services are coordinated so that our students get the best.
Ms. Harris?
Yes, thank you. So again, for the vast listening audience at home, Learning Center.
What's the
So the Learning Center is just, there are 11 learning centers in the district.
11.
11. 12. We keep having this debate.
Yes.
Well, wait,
Write it down.
we have, I believe, 140 elementary schools now. And so of those 140, 12 of them have a learning center.
Correct. So they are located throughout the district in regional locations. And the purpose of the Learning Center is to provide a, what used to be called self-contained classroom setting. Self-contained is where there is the special educator that is the content area teacher for those students. Students can be identified as appropriate for the Learning Center through the IEP process, and it could be because of some significant academic needs or behavioral needs. It also, the way that the Learning Centers are structured, students are allowed, based on what their needs are, to potentially go inside general education for certain courses. Some students may be receiving all of their academic instruction in their content areas, reading, math, social studies, science in the Learning Center, and may come out and be in general education for art, PE, music, and other elective courses. Or they may take math and reading in the Learning Center and social studies and science in the general education setting. So it just depends on student need.
And so I'm guessing that a fairly significant percentage of students at learning centers, that is not their home school.
Correct.
I mean, some may be, but so with only 12 in the county. And do we know, so if I think I'm doing my math right here, there are approximately 22,000 special education students in Montgomery County Public Schools currently. As of the data date you pulled, there were 5,902 duly identified EML and special education. So by my math, that is 27% of our special education population is duly identified. Do we know the students, what percentage of our special education students, I guess elementary special education students, are at learning centers instead of at their home school?
We do. The percentage of, are you asking the percentage of duly identified?
In the
First, just number of
Yes, we can.
elementary special education students at a learning center.
Yes, I don't have that number with me, but we can certainly get it
Yes,
for you.
because I would also be interested in seeing, overall, what's that breakdown? What percentage of those elementary students that are in special education are in a learning center? And also the percentage of elementary duly identified students who are in a learning center. I'd be very interested to see how that breaks down. And then I did have a question. So you said back at the beginning of the meeting that the WIDA looks, after kindergarten, the WIDA looks at 4 domains: speaking, listening, reading, writing. And that looking at slide 30, I see it's EML access by domain, and then it's got listening and speaking identified in a whole bunch: entering, emerging, developing, expanding, bridging. What does that mean?
Okay, so There are 6 levels in the range of language development. So those levels, starting entering, is you're at the very beginning stages of your language development. Emerging, and when we talk about ELP 1, 2, 3, those numbers correspond. So entering means you're at a 1. Emerging means you're at a 2. Developing, a 3. Expanding, a 4. Bridging, a 5, and reaching, a 6. But we know that our students are exited at a 4.5 or higher. And so most of our students, when you take all the composites together, they are more so in the expanding range of their language development holistically. It doesn't mean all of their domains are expanding. What we see is some of their domains are way stronger than others, and then the last domains to come along are typically our writing and our reading sometimes.
Okay.
Speaking is difficult because you're talking about the academic language of the content, and so you'll see some lower scores there as well, but that's what those levels mean.
Okay.
Yeah.
And backing up, just, sorry for a question. The website that we looked at earlier, so does that list the 12 elementary schools that have learning centers?
I will check while we speak.
Oh, yeah,
But
okay,
I know
yes.
that the map identifies it. I'm not sure that it delineates it each by service.
Okay.
So I'll check while we.
And just a question, looking at slide 38, one of the things that you mentioned as a challenge was that students who can't test out of WIDA due to the nature and severity of their disability. So looking at the 4 domains, is that because a student may not be, they may be aphasic, so they don't speak, or because they have hearing impairments? I mean, what are the types of issues that prevent a student from being accurately actually assessed based on WIDA because of their disability?
Yeah, so you have to be able to complete all 4 domains on the WIDA Access for ELS assessment in order to generate an overall composite score, which then says where your language development and growth falls. And so some students, based on, you just described some students who may have difficulties with particular domains that would tend to maybe register that domain lower, or the student can't participate in the domain, et cetera, in its entirety. So these are issues we have raised with WIDA and the state. And so recently at one of our state briefings, we got word that WIDA is working on some alternate measures to be able to have students who fit those types of profiles participate in the domains that they can, and then WIDA would figure out a way to be able to score those domains that they can participate in to measure their growth. But that's a coming attraction. I don't know much about it, but it is something we have been working with the state to work with WIDA on for a number of years. And so we're at the point where, it sounds like it's close, it's on the horizon.
Okay, because I know one of the things you mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation was that for students who are in special education or dually identified, progress is measured differently. But I know from talking to a lot of our special educators, one of their frustrations for a long time has been the extent to which MCPS requires the exact same sort of types of instructional mapping and benchmarking for their students with significant special needs as they do for general education students, and it just isn't really relevant for the work that they do in the classroom. And so I would say, I would just be, when looking at students who are duly identified and they can't fully participate in WIDA, so you might have a teacher who is pretty confident that the student is receptive. Language skills are pretty high, and their receptive language for English is high, but they can't satisfy the other domains to move up a level. And so do the classroom instructors, the special educators in the classroom have the ability to sort of acknowledge what they see and sort of adapt their approaches despite what the WIDA participation allows?
So definitely in-house, teachers use all data sources to inform instruction and inform delivery of instruction. So we definitely do not say only use the WIDA Access for L's assessment scores to provide X level of services to the student. At the state level, right now, the only way that you can exit ELD services is through the WIDA Access for L's assessment. So we might see some students, stagnating at a particular level, but it does not mean that instruction or scaffolds or removing of scaffolds stays at that level. Our schools use other data sources to inform what's happening. So, we're part of it is we are beholden to the federal law and what the state has determined as the route for exiting. And then it's, again, being so student-specific and student-driven that we are matching the services to what our students need.
If I could just add on, it's one of the pieces that sometimes gets lost is that MCPS, us, this team right here, is making a whole lot of ridiculous requirements on me as a classroom teacher or a paraprofessional. And we have to communicate better what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I know we try, but these are guided by federal programs, by federal laws, for which we're accountable and for which we receive funding. We submit reports and plans on an annual basis, sometimes resubmitting 3 and 4 times after receiving feedback from the state who is guiding us in our federal applications. So it's a highly accountable area, right? Any area that could be misconstrued as not serving our children or that could indicate that we have an area of need, we're required then to do corrective action or action plan to do better. So I want our teachers to understand that we know that this work is challenging, right? These needs of our children and the desires of our families are complicated, right? But I also want them to know we're not creating we're trying not to create barriers for them. We're trying to help us provide the services in the best way possible. And so sometimes that means that we need to do professional learning and that we need to be sure that they have the tools that they need to build capacity to deal with what are challenging, right, in the classroom. So I think that's an area that we can all get better on in terms of communicating the why. We didn't sit and write IDEA, nor would we have, but we are responsible and accountable for carrying it through and making sure that it happens both on the accountability side, that we're following the law, and that we're providing the services to students. And so with that challenge is making sure that people are not feeling overwhelmed, but they're feeling supported, that they do have behavioral strategies and techniques to deal with new and complex behaviors, that they do have language objectives. They understand how to do content language for them. But this truly is a partnership because it's not getting easier. We have to be clear on what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, and understand that we are accountable for it.
Thank you so much for everyone. I think I want to be respectful of everyone's time too. I know that we have run way over. Today's conversation highlighted several things for me. One of it is how important training it is, as you mentioned, right? To really do our Tier 1 instruction well, the front load instruction well. It's important. All staff, all teachers need to learn the strategies and have the tools to work with all our students. And also, it highlighted to me how important planning actually is to create space to have conversations between different teams of professionals so that our students can get the support they need and our teachers are talking informed, and then they can be at their best in providing services for our students. So these are all the I think, area in the future I would like to hear more about. For each of our students is unique. It's an individual, and we have so many staff working in the school system. How do we work together as a team to support every one of our students? I'm going to go to my colleagues for some last remarks.
Just thank you for the work. I have boundless admiration for our special educators because the work they do is so very challenging. And I think there's a reason we are having trouble attracting people into that very, very important profession because the work is so very, very hard. So very, very much appreciate the work.
Thank you so much. This has been a very informative and presentation and dialogue. I thank you for all your work in this area. Thank you so much. Meeting is adjourned.